here in Los Fresnos, Texas. I hope you've had a great Saturday. I hope you've been enjoying your weekend. Tonight or today, I got to see baby Talia. It's the newest little one at the table. We're excited that she's now part of our family, and it's pretty awesome to see God work in the life of this little one. It was so good to meet with her parents and others in the family. So pretty excited about what's going on with Josh and Isabel and Talia. So be praying for Isabella and Talia as they are continuing to be in the hospital there. Hopefully they'll be coming home soon. Tomorrow we're at the Los Fresnos Community Center at 10:30 in the morning, and it's our worship service, our weekly worship service. Grace Under Pressure is the topic of discussion throughout Lent, and we're looking at how Jesus was grace under pressure for us at the cross, and how he's doing that for us and helping us to have grace under pressure as well. And so tomorrow we'll be taking another look at Jesus and his grace under pressure at the cross, and I hope you can make it and be there with us and join us in worship. This is Saturday, so it's time for another Mythbuster. And tonight, we're not going to get too deep tonight, but we are going to look at one Mythbuster. It came up this week, in fact, because this week, a couple times, we looked at the whole subject of Jonah and the story of Jonah. Not really necessarily Jonah and the great fish. We haven't really talked about that too much. What we've been looking at is the repentance that happened in Nineveh as a result of Jonah's preaching. And one of the things that we said along the way was that Nineveh repents, but there's a couple of things going on in the text that lead us to believe that this repentance isn't the only thing that's going on with Nineveh. Nineveh, of course, is the city where the Assyrians, that was their capital city, and it's where they it's where they lived for the most part. Nineveh and the surrounding areas, and it's the place that was often a thorn in the side of Israel. And Assyria had already, and Nineveh had already been doing some things to Israel at that time, because Israel had been disobedient and God had started to let Assyria pester Israel, so to speak. God sends Jonah to their enemies, sends them to Assyria, sends them to Nineveh, the capital city. It says, go preach there. And of course, part of the story is that Jonah is swallowed by a fish because he doesn't go. But ultimately, he ends up in Nineveh, and he preaches. One day, it says, and in one day, the entire city is believing God. That's the first thing that we see in the text. The other thing that we see in the text, other than them repenting in sackcloth and ashes, is that Jonah is a sign. Jonah is a sign for Nineveh. The fact that he spent a significant amount of time, 3 days and 3 nights, in a fish, in the sea, in the Mediterranean, that was a sign to the Assyrians, a sign to Nineveh. Jesus picks up on that, and this is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 to 41. Jesus is having a conversation with scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel. And if you know anything about the scribes and Pharisees in the biographies of Jesus, for the most part, they're not very nice. They're the antagonists of the text. Rome is part of the antagonism, but certainly it's the religious establishment. It's the church guys that are not playing nice with Jesus, not believing Jesus, in fact. So they're having a kind of a testy conversation. This is what Jesus says to them. Jesus answers the scribes and Pharisees, an evil and adulterous generation demands a sign. And this is what they were doing. They were looking for a sign. Hey, show us another sign. And of course, these biographies of Jesus that we have in the New Testament are full of Jesus' signs. He's constantly doing things. In fact, the book of John is known as the book of signs. And in John, we see Jesus doing things like turning water into wine and walking on the water, feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, raising Lazarus. But all of those are signs that Jesus is the promised one of the Old Testament. and he is the one to be believed. And that's going on in Matthew as well. And so they want to see more signs. And Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation are demanding a sign, but no sign is going to be given it except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. And what is that sign? Well, just as Jonah was in the belly of the huge fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at Jonah's preaching. And look, something greater than Jonah is here. It's interesting. Something greater. It's actually someone who is greater than Jonah is here. But people demanding signs, Jesus says, you know what? There's only one sign. It's the sign of Jonah. It's the sign of the Son of Man, actually. And what is that? Well, he says it. The sign of Jonah was Jonah being in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights and then rising. That's the sign that is given to the religious leaders, the religious establishment, those Christians that were looking for the miraculous. And Jesus says, you know what? You're looking for all the wrong things. What you need to be looking for is Jesus, myself, and the gospel. Death and resurrection. The only sign that you need is the sign that you're going to get. And that's my death and resurrection. So you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with myth busting? In this passage, Jesus is telling the scribes and the Pharisees that the only sign that they need, the only sign that they'll be given, the only sign that they need is his sign, the sign of his death and his resurrection. What they need is his gospel. That's the sign. His death and resurrection, that's the sign. That's the sign they get. That's the sign they need. And so our Mythbusters is that Jesus is the sign. He's everything that God has promised for us. We don't need anything else. And so tomorrow at the table, we're going to have a sign. Tomorrow at the table, we're going to have a miracle. I guarantee it. I promise it. In fact, I guarantee it every week. And you know what that is? The sign and the miracle that will be at the table tomorrow is the same one that was at the table last week. Word and sacrament. Jesus preached in his word, giving life, salvation, and forgiveness to his people through his word and through communion, through the Lord's table. We have a miracle every week. It's the table. I often hear people say, we're looking for a miracle. We want a miracle. If you want a miracle, then come to the table. Every week, at 10:30 at the Los Fresnos Community Center, we've got a miracle. The only miracle that Jesus promises in the Bible that is a sign that we need. His death and resurrection given to us in his broken body and his shed blood through bread and wine. So like the scribes and Pharisees, I mean, this is a big deal. Like the scribes and Pharisees, we're always looking for signs. We're always wanting to see if God's going to communicate with me. And so I start looking for a sign. It's not just part of our Christian culture. I think we've adapted some things from the pop and folk religion. And pop and folk religion are big on signs and looking for signs in nature. So we start looking for signs. You know, we see a face in the cloud or a face on our toast, or we see a popular phrase that pops up on our television, or we see some sort of something that shows up on a marquee, like, oh, hey, look at that phrase. That's God's sign to me today. God might be communicating through that somehow, but that's not a sign. We're constantly looking for these signs. The only sign that we're given about what God's will is for our life, what we're supposed to do, is what we're supposed to believe. The only sign that we're promised is Christ's death and resurrection. There are no other promises given to us but that one. That's the sign we're promised. So what Christ is saying that day to the scribes and Pharisees is what he's saying to us, and what he's saying to our penchant for always looking for something else, something beyond his word, something, I'm looking for some word of comfort. I'm looking for some word of assurance. I'm looking for something to confirm what I'm thinking in my heart. And so, I go to the store, I go to the beach, I go to a restaurant, I flip on the internet, and some of the words that just pop up on the screen all of a sudden, that's my sign. That is not what God has promised to do in terms of how he communicates his will to us. He's communicated that will through his Son. And that sign is his death and his resurrection. Christ said, this is the will of God for everybody, to believe in the one that he has sent. That's it. Now, there are other things we can talk about in terms of what God's will is for us, but even then, that is spoken to us through his word. At least it's promised. Does that mean that none of these other things are important? Not saying that. I'm simply saying that the only place where it's actually promised, that we know for sure that God has promised to give us a sign, is in Word. And tomorrow it's in Word and Communion at the table. That is our Mythbuster for today. And again, I can promise you, we're going to have a sign, we're going to have a miracle. It's called Jesus and his Word, Jesus and his sacrament, his communion with us at the table in his broken body and his shed blood. We do it every week. And so we know that every week that Jesus is going to be among us, he's going to be there because that's what he promised he would do. That's our Mythbuster. That's our conversation at the table for this evening. I hope you have a great Saturday evening. And again, if you don't have any place to go to church on Sunday, be at the table tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. And I guarantee you, Jesus is going to be there, and Jesus is going to be giving you a sign and giving you a miracle in his word and in his sacraments. Until then, you can know this for sure too. This is another promise that he gives us, that Jesus will be with you tonight. You can rest well tonight because